Well, this morning as I was getting out of the car, Jeannie said to me, "Knock 'em dead." I said, "That was last Sunday, if you were here for the sermon." And she just meant,
asked you to break a leg, you know.
she might have said that to Marty, break a leg, Marty. No. Anyway.
Broken leg would have been less painful, I think.
It might have been. Well, let's turn to the book of Exodus chapter 1. If you remember, last week, 2 weeks ago, we were looking at the Exodus 1 for the first time. And we got down to about verse 17, I think. And remember that the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, they had enslaved the Hebrew people, and they were increasingly oppressing them and making life increasingly miserable for them. And he was trying to really destroy them because they were becoming so numerous. But the more he oppressed them, the more they grew, more they multiplied, it said. And so he takes the second measure. They're just trying to work him to death to start with. That didn't work. So then we get into the section at verse 15 where the Pharaoh instructs the Hebrew midwives, two women, to basically to execute or leave exposed whatever method that he wanted them to use. It doesn't explain all of the details, but they were to, in effect, kill the male children of the Israelites. Females were okay, but they didn't want the males to live because they were afraid that if there was a war with any of their neighbors, which were constant in the Middle East then, and they're still constant, but they were constantly at war with their neighbors, both in North Africa, all the way over into Assyria, Babylonia, the Hittites, who were in what is today Turkey. All of those nations were at war with each other at one time, and Egypt was the great power of the region at this point when Moses was born. And so to eliminate that threat or reduce it, he ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill one way or the other, to kill these infant boys. And then at verse 17, a key statement, I think a marvelous statement about the midwives. It said, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive." The midwives feared God. You know, this is an illustration that we find a good number of places in the scriptures where an earthly authority, a king, a governor, somebody, an emperor, instructs the people of God to do something that is against the will of God, and they refuse. You can think of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. You can think of others in the New Testament that did the same thing, that just refused to obey the king. And it tells us something about our relationship to civil authorities, that when they command us to do something that's illegitimate, that's against the will of God, it is perfectly right and everything to say no and to refuse to do what they said, because above all, we fear God, and our ultimate loyalty is to God. And we all know that, but this is another illustration here in the beginning of the Old Testament where the greatest king of that age in that place commands them to do something and they refuse to do it. And they're just lowly women. They're not great women in any sense that the world would recognize. They had a responsible position of authority. Probably they were the leaders of the training the midwives for the whole nation and so on. But they feared God. Now again, fear in this case is not terror. It's awe, respect, honor, glorifying God, and all of those kinds of synonyms that can come in to describe what it means to fear God, to honor God, to love God, to obey God. And all of that is involved in fearing of God. And so they feared God and refused to obey the Pharaoh. So the king of Egypt called for them and asked them why they had done this. In verse 18, he called for the midwives, said to them, "Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive?" You may wonder about that alive on the end of these two statements. That's a Hebrew way of talking. It reflects the way that the Hebrews thought about living in life and saying something like this. It's not normal in English, we could say it that way, but that's literally what the Hebrew says. So, why have you done this thing? Why did you, now remember, these pharaohs have absolute power. The pharaohs, kings of Egypt, were considered to be divine by their people. They were considered to be gods. So he has the absolute right over everybody and everything in that country, including the death penalty, of course. Now we'll see that Moses doesn't, even though he's raised as a son of Pharaoh. But Pharaoh does. He has absolute right. So to refuse to obey him could be a death penalty. But they feared God, whatever the consequences were, which they didn't know, but whatever those consequences were, they feared God and they saved the children. And so Pharaoh brings them in question. And the midwife said to Pharaoh, well, some people question whether they were actually lying here or not. I don't think it's technically a lie. It is an evasion, for sure. But the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. Okay? For they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Well, then you wonder, why were there midwives? If they're not needed, why were there? Maybe that's why there's only two of them, because they just normally have their babies before the midwives could get there. Now, remember that they were also, the Hebrews were being oppressed. They were working physically very, very hard. And that might have actually been somewhat true, that a lot of times babies were born before the midwives could be called and get there, because sometimes, distances to travel and places where people live were not easy to access. But it appears it's more of an evasion of Pharaoh. They're thinking of a good reason, what they consider to be a good reason, and making an excuse that, we can't help this. They just get there. They have the baby so soon we just can't get there. So Egyptian women don't do that. You need midwives, but we don't most of the time. Okay, so that was their excuse. I don't think that's a lie exactly. It probably has some truth in it, because so in verse 20, therefore, always remember what therefore is there for. Therefore points back to what we have just read in verse 20. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, can't leave that word out, because they honored him, they feared him, they obeyed him, they would not commit this series, almost a half genocide, I guess you'd call it, just killing one sex. But anyway, Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. They were already mighty and were growing. It said they multiplied rapidly over there earlier in the chapter, and now they just continue to multiply, the Hebrews do. So things are getting worse and worse for the Egyptians. The more they try to go against what God wills. Remember, God had promised they were going to multiply like the sand of the sea, like the stars in the heavens, that they were going to multiply like that. And they're in the process here in this foreign country, functioning as slaves, and yet God is multiplying them and blessing them as they go. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. So not only does he multiply the nation, but these particular two midwives are blessed in particular for their fearing of God, their honoring of God's purposes. And we're going to see that, of course, that's the pattern in the scriptures. If you obey God, God blesses you. Maybe not always in the way that we might want or anticipate, or others might anticipate, but he blessed them. He gave them households, meaning that they had their own children. And quite a thing that they honored God like that, and then he honored them for their faithfulness to him. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So now he goes from the midwives to putting the burden on the whole nation. That is the nation of the Hebrews, not the Egyptians. He's not telling the Egyptians to do this to their own. The context is clear that he's talking to all of the Hebrew women, all of the Hebrew families. When they have a baby boy, they are to execute that child some way.
My Bible must be a bad translation, because mine says, then Pharaoh gave this order to his people, every boy that is 3.
Well, they were his people.
Oh, I read that like to the Egyptians. He considered them his people
Yeah,
also.
they belonged to him. They were slaves.
So the Egyptians could also, if they saw a baby boy, but it also applied to the Israelites.
Well, I suppose they could do that too, in obeying what Pharaoh had ordered. But I think the context is clear that he's talking to the Hebrews.
Okay.
To kill their own children, to expose them, kill them. But maybe he certainly isn't telling the Egyptians to kill their own children.
No, I thought it was reading that the Egyptians now had complete authority to go into any Israelite home and take any male child and kill it.
It possibly could be at least partly that. He does go on to say, every son who is born to you shall be cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So this is precisely the same thing that he had said for the midwives to do, really, not cast them into the river, but to kill them. So the context, I think, is pretty clear that he is talking just to the Hebrews. Now, it may be that the Egyptian army and everybody else, all the Egyptian people, had this authority, but you can imagine that if they tried to do this by force, and the Hebrew people weren't cooperating, then the Egyptians, you could get into a civil war just really quick. So I think that he's telling the Hebrews to do this themselves, and they're afraid of him. Remember again that they're slaves, and they're really under control of Pharaoh, and he's got the greatest army in the world. You know, if you go back and you read about this era of history, they were feared. The Egyptians were feared all over the ancient world at this point, because they were the prime manufacturers of chariots. And if you've ever seen a movie where they had some of these chariots, they were equivalent to a modern tank, I would guess. It'd be the closest equivalent, but they were fairly large, sometimes had as many as 4 people on them. One of them a driver, the other 3 bearing weapons, spears, bows and arrows. They had big blades on the wheels that stuck out like this, that sharpened blades that were attached to the hubs of the wheels. So they would just drive into enemy infantry and just cut people to ribbons. Of course, the horses were armored and they would just they were trained to run into a shield wall and do all that. Anyway, they had a ferocious army. And so the Hebrews had a right, or it was understandable that they would be afraid of the Pharaoh. And so you would think they might do what he told them to do. But these two women paid no attention to that. So, yeah, that's a good question. In fact, it was brought up in some of the commentary that this isn't crystal clear. I think it is from the context, but not from the verse if you just take that verse. Yes. Okay? So that's a good question.
Thank you.
That's a good question. All right. It's always, always, always important that we look at context when we're looking at the scriptures. Failure to do that leads to all kinds of misinterpretations. We've been looking at a passage in Colossians on Wednesday night the last couple of weeks. The context is important in the same way to interpret the relationship of baptism and circumcision. Right, Pastor? The context, the whole context of that. In fact, the context of the whole book of Colossians, let alone many other scriptures that speak to that issue. And ultimately, the context for all passages of scriptures, not only the book they're in or the passage they're in, but the entire Bible a lot of the times sheds light on what a given verse may or may not mean. Okay? So Pharaoh commanded his people now, and I think he's talking again about the Hebrews. They're his people. He owns them. He's the Lord over all of He's Lord over all of Egypt, and everybody that lives there, and particularly of the Hebrews in this case. Okay, any other question or comments you want to make? This passage, these first couple of chapters of Exodus are not difficult to follow, and we all know the stories. Yes.
I wonder if these midwives prayed to God, what should we say, what should we do? And maybe God gave them this, that the Hebrew women are liable.
They accused President Trump of being a dictator. Shoot. Let's see what a dictator's like. Read about these guys like Pharaoh or somebody like that, I mean, who have absolute power over the nation. All right. Yeah, I would think if they had time, they would certainly have prayed about it. But yeah, I think they were godly women. So obviously, they would have known right from wrong about things and murder. Every culture knows about murder. And here they're telling you to murder your own people. You know, not doing that. But there are people that would. If you know anything about the Holocaust, you know that the Nazis ran the camps in large part through Jewish people that were traitors to their own people. They called them kapos. I don't know what that means. That's probably a pastor knows, but I don't remember. I think it's a Yiddish word, but I don't know. Maybe they called them kapos. Because it's not unusual for somebody like this to use their own people. Every culture has those that are turncoats that are more afraid of fear of civil power, military power than they are of God, of course. And that's what makes these two women so outstanding. Is they were willing to confront Pharaoh. When he asked them, they give him an answer. I suspect there had to be a grain of answer. He doesn't say, well, take these two women out and execute them. I mean, as far as we know, he didn't say that. Also, one of the things that we're going to see, you see throughout the Bible really, is that a very long story is often reduced to a very short space in the scriptures. There's all kinds of questions you could ask about things. What happened in between here, and how were they supposed to execute them? We know at one point here he tells them throw them in the river. Well, we'll see what happens about that. But okay, any other comment or question on this first chapter? Let's move on to chapter 2. I've given you notes.
Michael, should we assume that from verse when he told the midwives to get rid of them, to when he told the people to kill, should we assume that maybe a few years might have happened? Otherwise, how would Pharaoh have known that the people were growing unless he suddenly saw a lot of young men coming in? Is it possible then that he was watching so carefully that it was only a few weeks from one order to the next?
That's
He
a
had to have
question for
someone-
which there is no answer.
Okay, all right. Fine.
That's one of the things. It might have been a few days, it might have been a few weeks, it might have been a few months, and it might even have been years. Because it's going to take a while for this process to play out, obviously. We're going to see some more of that kind of thing as we go. And those are the kinds of things that come up that you can ask questions. But an honest person that's dealing with what the scripture actually says is going to say, we don't know, and we don't. It probably was a fair amount of time in there, I would think, months probably, but who knows? That's just a speculation on my part. And when I was teaching, I told my students all the time, when you're speculating, tell the people you're speculating. You may be speculating accurately according to the culture and so on, and it may be very, very likely what you're saying, but don't say scripture says something when it doesn't. There was a time lapse for sure, but how much? I don't know. So, and there's lots of places in scripture that we can raise questions like that, and the answer is, if God doesn't reveal it, we don't know. Once in a blue moon, we can verify something outside of scripture. Archaeologists can verify something that this happened then and that happened then, or something like that. Occasionally, that might take place, but when scripture doesn't say, what we should say is, it doesn't say. We don't know. There was a time, some time, obviously. There had to be some time, but how much? I don't know. We don't need to know. There was enough time for Pharaoh to know that they weren't doing what he told them. That is for certain. Okay? Yes?
In verse 20, it does say that the people multiplied and grew very mightily. God dealt with the midwives. That kind of stretches the time out.
Yeah, it does. It would imply that it was probably years. At least 9 months. Probably. Of course, these Hebrew women are vigorous. Maybe they delivered at 8 months. Who knows? But yes. There's time for the population to grow. It took time. But the other factor might be that they were having babies all the time. And so Pharaoh may have wanted this to be implemented immediately and then saw that it wasn't being done. It did with the ones that were already pregnant, already near delivery time and that kind of thing. It's possible that, that this very likely began immediately. And so it might not take as long as it appears. If we start from scratch there, and all of the women that become pregnant from this day forward, that kind of thing, but Scripture doesn't say that. So there was time for Pharaoh to know that they were multiplying, that his orders were not being carried out. However long that took. It might have not taken very long. On the other hand, it could have taken years.
It seems like God's giving us a highlight reel of how he was going to bring Moses into power and how he did.
Absolutely, that's what this is all about, really. This entire story is about God raising up a leader to deliver his people from Egypt. This entire story is about Moses and his service to God and his relationship with God and what God does through Moses. I hesitate to say the entire story is about Moses because it's really about what God is doing through Moses. So I prefer to say it that way. But in terms of human beings, the story is completely about Moses and what God is doing through Moses. Yeah. If you even look at the second chapter, Moses features in the first 2 points, birth and rescue of Moses. Moses kills, flees, rescues, and marries. Go back to the Israelites crying out toward the end of the chapter, and so on. So, yeah, this whole story is about what God is doing to bring his people out of bondage and fulfill his covenant with them. Remember this increase, they were increasing mightily, they were growing rapidly and all that. This is a God's act in fulfilling his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. He's fulfilling his promises. He's keeping his covenant with them. And he's going to keep it through Moses as well, as of course we will see and you know. All right? Yes, that's a good point too, Bill. Thank you. Anybody else before we move on to chapter 2? Chapter 2 Chapter 2 is just a continuation. The story continues. You would leave out the chapter division. Wouldn't affect the thing here. It changes scene a little bit. You know, when you're watching a television program that's got 3 or 4 groups of people that are involved in the storyline, and sometimes sometimes at the beginning of the movie you'll see this group, and then it'll shift to the other group, and then back and forth, and you don't even know how. A lot of movies you don't even know how it connects until later on when everything all of a sudden comes together. That's how this goes together. Well, here at the beginning of chapter 2, we have a shift in the scene here. And a man of the house of Levi, one of the Levites, we're looking at 2:1, sent and took a wife as a daughter of Levi. Now this is during this time when, the Pharaoh has instructed the Hebrews to kill their children, okay? So the woman, he went in and took a wife of a daughter of Levi. He's a Levite, and he's marrying within the Levitical tribe. And so he takes the daughter, he marries the daughter. So the woman conceived and bore a son. Well, there's 9 months right there. Kaboom. If you want to talk about time frame, right there. Just in a portion of a verse. So, and then when she saw that he was a beautiful child, a handsome child, a lovely child, I guess all mothers think that their children are like that. So we'll forgive her for thinking that her child was that way. But a beautiful child. She hid him for 3 months. Another time lapse. Now we're talking about a year. That would apply to one or the other of these sections that have come in chapter 1. But hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, why couldn't she hide him anymore?
He was a baby, lusty, husky, healthy, crying baby.
He was growing. Yeah.
Or close to it, he was getting around.
3 months.
No, after, okay, no.
Well, if you had a child that's walking in 3 months, I don't know. I had one of my oldest daughter. I think she could do calculus when she was 5. I mean, she was just phenomenal with math. But anyway, not actually, but yeah. So 3 months. He's not a toddler, but he's getting big enough to squeal real loud. And it's probably becoming increasingly difficult to keep him hidden from the neighbors and others that, I'm sure there were people that were traitors that would report other Jews to the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's soldiers and stuff. I mean, reading between the lines of what happens in other situations, other times, that, she was quite afraid that this was going to become known. So what could she do? So when she could no longer hide him, for whatever reason, she took an ark of bulrushes, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. So she makes a boat A lot of people that study this section of Old Testament think that what this is describing is an ark would have been not just a box like we think of the Ark of the Covenant, but more like the Ark of Noah's, but shaped in the form of a boat made out of the reeds and stuff, which they actually made ships that went up and down the Nile out of these reeds at times. They dried them out and formed them. They could be bent and formed anyway. So she makes a little boat for this child, and she puts him in it, puts him in the bulrushes, in the papyrus plants maybe that were there and to hide him so that if they came looking for him in the house or whatever, they couldn't find him, and he was being kept safe. This is the second deliverance by an ark that we see in the Old Testament. It's called the ark, same word that's used with what Noah built. So she took that ark, made that boat, sealed it up with asphalt and pitch so that it would float, wouldn't leak, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And to protect him even further, she obviously cares about this child. She stood, and his sister, who's the sister? We don't have her name here, but
Miriam.
we know who she is. Miriam. Yeah. His older sister, Miriam, stood afar off to know what would be done to him. So, easy to picture this. I mean, this was a last desperate measure to save this child. They were not going to obey what Pharaoh said. Again, we see women saving Moses here, giving birth to Moses, saving Moses, his sister taking part in his being saved through this ark. I think there's deliberate connotations and relationship to the Ark of Noah with this. Same kind of thing that the deliverer was delivered through this subterfuge on the part of Moses' mother. Okay, so again, we don't know how long this went on. We don't know how long he was in the ark, how long they kept him there. They would have obviously had to feed him. And I mean, you can start speculating about how long it took for various reasons, because they would have had to get him out of there every day and feed him or arrange to have him fed. Somehow, he wouldn't last long without water and food lying in that ark in the river in the sun and whatever. So they did what they could do, and we don't know for how long this went on. My own speculation, is that it didn't take long. It probably didn't last a long time, maybe a week or two, who knows. But it was a last desperate measure to save this child. But at verse 5, then the daughter of Pharaoh, a princess. Some historians think we know her name, Hatshepsut. It was a daughter of, I think, the Pharaoh Thutmose. Nobody's really certain. It's interesting that we have the names of the two midwives, but the greatest man of his generation, militarily, in terms of civil things, was the Pharaoh. We don't know his name. We don't know the names of anybody that does anything. We don't know the Pharaoh's daughter's name. Wasn't important. Wasn't what the story was about. This isn't just a history lesson. This isn't just being written for history. This is far more than just history. This is divine history. This is God's history of what he is doing for his people. So the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Probably a typical thing. It may not have been bathing to get clean. The Nile River was considered to be the waters of the Nile were considered by the Egyptians to be sacred. Their entire livelihood depended upon the Nile River and the annual flooding of the Nile to make the land fertile and grow all of the wheat and the crops that they grew. Egypt was a major food source for the ancient world because of its rich land, partially because the Nile flooded every year when the rains came to the south in southern Egypt and down up into Ethiopia. The rains would come there and the water would rush down and pick up the silt, and the land would flood. It would drop the silt, it would go away. Then they would go out and remark all the fields and stuff and replant. So the Nile River's waters were considered sacred. So this may have been not just a normal bath to get clean, but it may have been a religious ritual that she was involved in every day. Who knows? Again, that's speculation on the part of scholars that study this kind of thing. But her maidens walked along the riverside, probably to protect her, to make sure nobody intruded. If she's actually bathing, maybe she's in the nude, who knows? And so they're there to protect her. So they're walking along with her while she's doing whatever she's doing in this bath in the ablution, or actually bathing, who knows? But walking along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. Okay, simple enough, easy to understand. And when she opened it, she saw the child. Apparently had a lid on it, protect that child from the sun. And remember, it had been sealed with pitch and all that, and was waterproof. And so she opens the lid, and there's this beautiful male child. Remember that the Semites and the Egyptians and all these ancient peoples in the ancient world look pretty much alike. So when a baby was born, you couldn't tell a Hebrew baby from an Egyptian baby just by looking at it. I mean, it had to be. And so it was a beautiful child, and she opened it. She saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. Interesting detail. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. I mean, it wouldn't take much to figure out why somebody would be trying to secret a baby in this little boat, knowing she would have known, that being the daughter of Pharaoh, she would have known everything that was going on in that kingdom, pretty much. And speculating again, but it's very likely that she would have known, and maybe from the way the thing was constructed, maybe from the clothes the swaddling clothes he had, or whatever he had, again, Scripture doesn't tell us all those details, but if you're going to make a movie of this, like the Ten Commandments, you got to fill in the gaps, and so I'm filling in a little bit of them too here this morning. So anyway, she had compassion. He wept, and she had compassion on him. This is one of the Hebrews' children. Now that's pretty interesting up to that point, but what is so interesting is, remember that the sister, Miriam, is watching this. And remember, Miriam's name is not mentioned at this point either. It's not important that we know it's Miriam. We don't know that from later. But then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, pretty brazen thing to do, really, isn't it? I mean, Pharaoh's daughter is not just a nobody. She's a princess. She has political power, political authority to some extent. And so, for this little girl, assuming she's little, she wasn't that much older than Moses, we don't think. So she was a little girl, and she's just watching, and she goes right up to Pharaoh's daughter when after she opens the little ark, and there's Moses crying. And so she comes up to him, and shall I go? And asks her, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women? Interesting that, to me, that she would have the audacity to go ask a question like that. I mean, yeah.
I think she may have watched to see Pharaoh's daughter's reaction.
Response.
And when she saw, I imagine Pharaoh's daughter embraced Moses that's when she had the gumption to go up and say,
Yeah, yeah.
I think she's a very smart young girl.
oh, very.
You know, thinking that, okay, this is a good way to get him back to the Hebrew women.
Yeah, yeah. He also, remember that if Pharaoh's daughter obeyed what Pharaoh said, this infant's life was at stake.
Yeah, she didn't want her to keep it.
Yeah, Pharaoh would have not wanted to keep it for sure. Yes, really?
Oh, this whole second chapter just raises all kinds of questions in my heart. And I appreciate what Bill said, that it's all God's plan. And
Absolutely.
you know, when we entrust a situation to our God, and it deals with personalities and temperaments and all these excuses, and yet if we trust God with our circumstance, God can change hearts. And to think that they would recognize this Hebrew and they would take it into their home. I just don't
Yes.
understand that at all.
Yes, given what Pharaoh's orders were and what
No.
the threat that the Egyptians saw that the Hebrews were to their existence as an empire, maybe. Yeah, this is a gutsy thing. It was gutsy things on Pharaoh's daughter's part to do, on Miriam's part as well as Pharaoh's daughter. So, all right. Well, read chapter 3. We'll continue with this next week. I find these stories to be fascinating. So we'll look at what happens from there, because God is hard at work here, and